Thunder crashed across the Wyoming sky as Hattie Garner stumbled through the darkness, her sodden skirts heavy against her legs and her fingers numb with cold. The year was 1878, and the merciless winter storm had caught her unaware on her journey back from delivering medicines to a neighboring homestead. "Please, just a little further," she whispered to herself, teeth chattering as the bitter wind cut through her woolen coat. Her horse had bolted when lightning struck too close, leaving her stranded miles from town with night falling fast. In the distance, a single light glimmered through the torrential rain, her only hope in the growing darkness. Hattie had come west 3 months prior, a trained nurse from Boston seeking a fresh start after losing her parents to influenza. At 22, she had thought herself prepared for frontier life, but nothing could have readied her for the harshness of Wyoming territory. The rain turned to sleet, then snow, pelting her face and blurring her vision as she forced her frozen legs forward. The light grew closer, a cabin nestled against the foothills, smoke curling from its chimney despite the storm's fury. Hope surged through her veins as she staggered the final yards to the porch. With the last of her strength, Hattie pounded on the rough-hewn door. "Hello, please, is anyone there?" Her voice was barely audible over the howling wind. She tried the handle, but it was locked firmly, barred against the elements and whatever dangers lurked in the wilderness. Panic welled in her chest as minutes passed with no response. She was locked out in the storm, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Desperation drove her to pound harder, her frozen knuckles aching with each impact. Just as her knees began to buckle, the door swung open, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the warm glow of a hearth fire. A man with broad shoulders and a weathered face peered out at her, surprise evident in his steel blue eyes. "Good heavens," he exclaimed, taking in her drenched appearance and blue-tinged lips. Without hesitation, he reached out and drew her inside, his calloused hand warm against her frozen arm. "You'll never freeze again," he said firmly, shutting the door against the howling storm. Hattie swayed on her feet, relief and exhaustion washing over her in equal measure. The man steadied her with a gentle grip on her shoulders. "Name's Henry Fletcher," he said, guiding her toward the fire. "And you look half dead, Miss Garner," she managed through chattering teeth. "Hattie Garner, the town nurse. My horse the storm, save your explanations for when you're warmed through," Henry interrupted, wrapping a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders. "You're safe now." The cabin was modest but neat, with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, and a bed tucked in the corner. Tools hung on the walls alongside a rifle and a worn saddle. It was the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his surroundings. Henry moved with purpose, stoking the fire and putting a kettle on to boil. Hattie watched him through half-closed eyes, noting the easy way he moved despite his size. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a beard that couldn't quite hide the strong line of his jaw. "You'll need dry clothes," he said matter-of-factly, rummaging through a chest near the bed. He returned with a flannel shirt and trousers that would dwarf her frame. "They'll be too big, but they're clean and dry. I'll step outside while you change." "No," Hattie clutched his arm in sudden panic. "Please don't go out in that storm. I'll change behind the screen." She gestured to a wooden folding screen in the corner of the room. Henry nodded, his expression softening. "Take your time. I'll fix us some coffee and stew." Behind the screen, Hattie peeled off her sodden garments with trembling fingers. The simple act of removing her wet clothing brought immediate relief. She slipped into Henry's shirt, the soft flannel enveloping her like an embrace, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. The trousers were indeed enormous, but she rolled the waistband and cuffs, securing them with a length of cord she found draped over the screen. When she emerged, Henry was ladling stew into bowls at the table. He glanced up, and something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. Whatever it was, it disappeared quickly behind a mask of practical concern. "Better?" he asked, pulling out a chair for her. "Much, thank you, Mr. Fletcher." Hattie sank into the seat, extending her hands toward the bowl's warmth. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been home." "Henry," he corrected, sitting across from her, "and it's fortunate I was. I'd normally be out with the cattle, but the storm drove me back early. He passed her a spoon. Eat. It'll warm you from the inside. The stew was simple but delicious venison with potatoes and carrots. Hattie hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the storm's fury outside. "You said you're the town nurse?" Henry finally asked, refilling her coffee cup. Hattie nodded. "I came from Boston 3 months ago. Dr. Wallace advertised for a nurse to assist him in Pine Creek." "That's 15 miles from here," Henry observed, his brow furrowing. "What brought you so far out alone?" Mrs. Timmons was expecting her baby. "Doctor Wallace is away in Cheyenne, so I rode out yesterday to attend the birth." Hattie sipped her coffee. "The baby came this morning, a healthy boy. I was heading back when the storm hit. My horse spooked at a lightning strike and bolted. I've been walking for hours." Henry's expression darkened. "You're lucky to be alive. These spring storms can turn deadly in minutes." "I'm beginning to understand that," Hattie admitted, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "In Boston, a storm meant finding a handsome cab rather than walking. Out here, it's different." "The West doesn't forgive mistakes easily," Henry said, his voice gentler now. "But you made it. That shows grit." Hattie looked up, surprised by the compliment. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She looked away first, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of their situation. "I should try to reach town tomorrow," she said, staring into her coffee cup. "They'll be worried." Henry shook his head. "Not possible. This storm's settling in for at least 2 days, according to my aching knee. Old injury," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Never lies about weather. You're welcome to stay until it passes." Hattie's heart fluttered with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Staying alone with a strange man would be scandalous in Boston, but frontier practicalities superseded Eastern proprieties. Besides, there was something about Henry Fletcher that inspired trust. "Thank you," she said simply. "I promise not to be a burden." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Having company during a storm is hardly a burden, Miss Garner. It's been a while since I've had conversation that didn't involve horses or cattle." After dinner, Henry added logs to the fire while Hattie insisted on washing their dishes in a basin of heated water. The domestic task felt oddly comfortable, as if she'd done it in this cabin 100 times before. When she finished, she found Henry at his bookshelf, selecting a volume. "You read?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. He turned, amusement crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Did you expect me to be illiterate because I'm a cowboy?" Hattie flushed. "No, many men I've met here don't have much time for books." "My mother was a schoolteacher," Henry explained, handing her the book, a collection of Tennyson's poems. "She believed education was as essential as breathing. Even after we moved west, she made sure I read every day." "She sounds wonderful," Hattie said, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. A shadow crossed Henry's face. "She was. She and my father died of cholera when I was 16. "That was 12 years ago now. I'm sorry," Hattie said softly. "I lost my parents to influenza last year. It's why I came west. Too many memories in Boston." Understanding passed between them, the knowledge of shared grief creating an unexpected bond. "Sometimes a fresh start is the only way forward," Henry said quietly. They settled before the fire, Henry in a hand-carved rocking chair and Hattie on a cushion near the hearth. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a peaceful atmosphere had descended. Henry read aloud from the Tennyson collection, his deep voice giving the poetry a richness that Hattie found mesmerizing. As the evening wore on, Hattie's eyelids grew heavy. The exhaustion of her ordeal, combined with the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of Henry's voice, lulled her toward sleep. She fought it, not wanting to appear rude, but eventually her head nodded forward. "Miss Garner," Henry's voice broke through her drowsiness. "You should take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Hattie straightened, blinking. "I couldn't possibly take your bed." "You nearly froze to death today," he countered firmly. "You need proper rest. I've slept in far worse places than my own cabin floor." Too tired to argue further, Hattie acquiesced. Henry turned his back politely as she slipped under the quilts of his bed. The sheets smelled of sunshine and pine. He must have dried them outdoors before the storm. "Good night, Miss Garner," Henry said, banking the fire for the night. "Hattie," she murmured, already half asleep. "Please call me Hattie." His low chuckle was the last thing she heard before sleep claimed her. "Good night, Hattie." The storm continued through the night and into the next day, snow piling against the cabin walls and wind howling down the chimney. Hattie woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Henry at the stove, frying salt pork and potatoes. Sunlight filtered weakly through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. "Morning," he greeted her, glancing over his shoulder. "Sleep well." Hattie nodded, suddenly shy as she remembered the intimacy of sleeping in his bed while he'd made do on the floor. "Better than I have in months, thank you." After breakfast, Hattie insisted on helping with chores. Despite Henry's protests, she found tasks to occupy herself mending a torn shirt she discovered in his sewing basket, reorganizing his meager collection of medicinal supplies, and teaching him how to properly wrap a sprained wrist when she noticed him favoring his left hand. "How did you injure it?" she asked, gently examining the swelling. "Roping accident 2 days ago," he admitted. "Steer pulled harder than I expected." Hattie clucked her tongue disapprovingly as she applied a poultice of herbs she found in his supplies. "You should have mentioned this yesterday." "You were half frozen," he replied with a shrug. "Seemed less important." "The stubbornness of men is universal," Hattie muttered, securing the bandage. Henry laughed, a rich sound that transformed his serious face. "So my mother always said." As the day progressed, they fell into an easy rhythm together. Henry taught Hattie how to play checkers with a hand-carved set, and she shared stories of Boston that made him laugh and ask questions. She learned he'd fought briefly for the Union during the final year of the Civil War, though he was reluctant to speak much about it. He'd come to Wyoming after his parents died, working as a cattle driver before saving enough to buy his own small spread 5 years ago. "It's not much," he said as they sat by the fire that evening. 50 head of cattle, 10 horses, but it's mine free and clear." "It's impressive," Hattie replied honestly. "You've built something from nothing. That takes courage and determination." Henry studied her face, as if searching for insincerity and finding none. "What about you? Nursing seems a difficult profession for a young woman." "My father was a doctor," she explained. "He believed women could be as capable as men in medicine. I assisted him from the time I was 16. She smiled at the memory. "He wanted me to attend medical school, but then the influenza came." Henry reached across the space between them and briefly touched her hand, a gesture of comfort so natural that neither of them seemed to notice its impropriety. "You honor him by using what he taught you." The second night, Hattie again tried to insist that Henry take his bed back, but he refused. "I'm accustomed to sleeping rough," he said firmly, "and you're still recovering from your ordeal." By the third day, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white snow that sparkled in the morning sunlight. After breakfast, Henry announced he would check his cattle and try to locate Hattie's horse. "I shouldn't be more than a few hours," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Will you be all right alone?" Hattie nodded, though she felt an unexpected reluctance to see him go. "I'll prepare lunch for when you return." After Henry left, the cabin seemed emptier somehow despite its small size. Hattie busied herself with domestic tasks, finding satisfaction in bringing additional order to Henry's already neat home. She discovered flour and lard in his stores and decided to surprise him with fresh biscuits, a small repayment for his hospitality. As she worked, Hattie found herself humming, something she hadn't done since before her parents died. There was a lightness in her spirit that had been absent for too long. She attributed it to surviving the storm and finding safety, but a small voice inside suggested it might have more to do with the cabin's owner than the cabin itself. Henry returned shortly after noon, stomping snow from his boots on the porch before entering. His cheeks were ruddy from cold, but his eyes brightened when he saw the table set for lunch, steam rising from a pot of stew she'd reheated. "You've been busy," he remarked, hanging his coat by the door. "It seemed the least I could do," Hattie replied, feeling inexplicably nervous under his appreciative gaze. "Any sign of my horse?" Henry nodded. "Found her sheltering with my herd. She's in the barn now, though I don't think the trail to town will be passable until tomorrow at the earliest. Hattie felt a conflicting mixture of relief and disappointment at the news. Another day in Henry's company was far from unwelcome, but she was conscious of having already imposed on his hospitality for 3 days. "I've taken advantage of your kindness for too long already," she began, but Henry cut her off with a shake of his head. "Having you here has been." He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Pleasant, very pleasant. I hadn't realized how much I missed conversation until you arrived." The simple admission touched Hattie deeply. "Well, then I'm glad my misfortune brought me to your door." They shared lunch, and afterward, Henry suggested teaching Hattie to shoot. "If you're going to ride these trails alone, you should know how to protect yourself," he explained, taking down his revolver from its peg on the wall. Outside in the crisp air, Henry patiently showed Hattie how to hold the weapon, how to aim, and how to account for the kickback. Her first shots went wild, but by the 10th attempt, she was hitting the tree stump he'd designated as a target. "You're a natural," Henry praised, his hand warm on her shoulder, "though I hope you never need to use these skills." "As do I," Hattie agreed, returning the gun to him with more confidence than she'd held it initially. "But thank you for teaching me." That evening, as they finished the last of the biscuits with honey Henry had traded from a neighboring homesteader, a comfortable silence settled between them. Hattie realized with a start that she felt more at home in this small cabin with this quiet cowboy than she had anywhere since leaving Boston. "What will you do when spring truly arrives?" Henry asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Hattie considered the question. "Continue my work with Dr. Wallace, I suppose. There's always need for medical care, especially as more settlers arrive." Henry nodded, staring into the fire. "Do you ever think of returning east?" "Sometimes," Hattie admitted. "When the wind howls like it did that night, or when I treat frostbite in children who don't have proper boots. But then I see the mountains at sunrise or help deliver a baby whose mother would have died without care, and I remember why I stayed." "The West gets in your blood," Henry said softly. "For all its harshness." "Yes," Hattie agreed, meeting his gaze. "It does." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of mutual understanding that went beyond words. Henry cleared his throat and stood abruptly, moving to add another log to the fire though it didn't need it. "We should try for town tomorrow," he said, his back to her. "If the weather holds, the trail should be clear enough." "Yes, of course," Hattie replied, trying to mask the disappointment in her voice. Their interlude was ending, and reality would soon reassert itself. "People will be wondering what happened to me." Henry turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "I'll escort you. It's not safe for you to ride alone after such a storm." "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to take you from your work, I insist," he interrupted firmly. "Besides, I need supplies from town anyway." Hattie nodded, grateful yet strangely melancholy. Their time in the cabin had created a bubble separate from the outside world, a place where conventions seemed distant and unimportant. Returning to town meant returning to propriety and the watchful eyes of Pine Creek's residents. That night, as Hattie lay in Henry's bed for what would be the last time, she found sleep elusive. She could hear him shifting on his bedroll near the fire, apparently equally restless. Tomorrow they would return to their separate lives, she to her small room behind Dr. Wallace's office, he to his solitary existence on this remote homestead. The thought left an unexpected ache in her chest. Morning came clear and bright, the snow already beginning to melt under the strengthening spring sun. They prepared for the journey in companionable silence, Hattie changing back into her own clothes, now cleaned and dried, while Henry packed provisions for the ride. As Hattie folded the borrowed shirt and trousers, she felt a curious reluctance to part with them. They carried Henry's scent and the memory of safety found in the midst of danger. Impulsively, she tucked a small handkerchief she had embroidered during her stay between the garments, a token of gratitude he would find later. The ride to Pine Creek took most of the day, the trail made difficult by lingering snow and mud. Henry led the way, occasionally glancing back to ensure Hattie was managing well. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, though the silence between them remained comfortable rather than awkward. As they crested the final hill overlooking Pine Creek, Hattie felt her heart sink. The town appeared exactly as she had left it, a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, the church steeple rising above the general store and saloon. It was her home now, yet suddenly it seemed lacking in some essential way. "Quite a sight after days of seeing nothing but my cabin walls," Henry commented, drawing his horse alongside hers. "Yes," Hattie agreed, forcing brightness into her tone. "I'm sure everyone will be relieved to see me safe." They rode down the main street, attracting curious glances from townspeople who had clearly been discussing the nurse's disappearance. Dr. Wallace emerged from his office as they approached, his elderly face creased with worry that quickly transformed to relief. "Miss Garner, thank the Lord," he exclaimed, hurrying forward as Henry helped Hattie dismount. "We feared the worst when your horse returned without you. Mr. Fletcher found me," Hattie explained, gesturing to Henry, who stood awkwardly holding the reins of both horses. "He sheltered me until the storm passed, Doctor." Wallace turned to Henry, extending his hand. "The town owes you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Fletcher. Miss Garner is invaluable to our community." Henry shook the doctor's hand briefly. "Anyone would have done the same." "Nevertheless, you must join us for dinner this evening," the doctor insisted. "My housekeeper has prepared a roast, and I'm sure Miss Garner would appreciate a proper meal after her ordeal." Before Henry could respond, Mrs. Wilkins, the postmaster's wife, bustled up to them, her expression a mixture of concern and barely concealed curiosity. "Miss Garner." "We've been beside ourselves with worry," she exclaimed, eyeing Henry suspiciously. "You poor dear, stranded alone with—" She trailed off meaningfully. "Mr. Fletcher saved my life, Mrs. Wilkins," Hattie said firmly, recognizing the implication in the woman's tone. "I would have frozen to death had he not taken me in," Mrs. Wilkins sniffed, clearly unconvinced. "Well, I'm sure it's all perfectly innocent, though what people might say, people can say what they like," Dr. Wallace interrupted with unusual sharpness. "Miss Garner is a professional woman of impeccable character, and Mr. Fletcher is known to be an honorable man. Now, if you'll excuse us, my patient needs rest." Chastened, Mrs. Wilkins retreated, though Hattie knew the woman would be spreading gossip within the hour. She glanced at Henry and found him watching her, his expression troubled. "You should go with the doctor," he said quietly. "I need to see to my supplies." "Will you come for dinner?" Hattie asked, suddenly desperate not to let him ride away. Henry hesitated, glancing around at the townsfolk who were trying to appear busy while obviously watching their interaction. "I don't think that would be wise. Your reputation is already compromised simply by arriving with you," Hattie finished for him. "So you might as well enjoy a good meal before riding home." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Dr. Wallace's dinner that evening was a subdued affair. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chambers, served the promised roast with potatoes and carrots, eyeing Henry with undisguised curiosity throughout the meal. The doctor attempted to maintain conversation, asking Henry about his ranch and cattle, but the atmosphere remained strained. Hattie felt the weight of propriety settling back onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In the town's eyes, she had spent 4 nights alone with a bachelor, a fact that would tarnish her reputation, regardless of the circumstances. The freedom she had felt in Henry's cabin seemed a distant memory now, replaced by the constraints of social expectations. After dinner, Henry declined coffee and announced his intention to start back to his ranch. "It'll be dark soon, and the trail is still treacherous in places," he explained, rising from the table. Dr. Wallace nodded in understanding. "Of course. But know that you're welcome in Pine Creek anytime, Mr. Fletcher. We don't forget those who help our own." At the door, Hattie found herself momentarily alone with Henry as the doctor returned to the dining room for Henry's hat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Henry studied her face, his blue eyes solemn. "It was my pleasure, Miss Garner." "Hattie," she corrected, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. "Hattie," he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice, more intimate somehow. "Take care on your rounds. I may not be around to rescue you next time." "Perhaps I'll be the one rescuing you," she countered with a small smile. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or admiration. Before he could respond, Dr. Wallace returned with Henry's hat. "Safe travels, Mr. Fletcher," the doctor said, handing it to him. "And remember what I said, you're welcome here anytime." Henry nodded his thanks, settled his hat on his head, and with one last glance at Hattie, stepped out into the gathering dusk. From the window, Hattie watched him mount his horse and ride away, a solitary figure against the darkening sky. Only when he disappeared from view did she realize she was clutching her hands together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "He seems a good man," Dr. Wallace observed quietly from behind her. Hattie turned, embarrassed to be caught staring after Henry. "He is. I owe him my life." The doctor's kind eyes studied her face. "Is that all you owe him, my dear?" Hattie felt heat rush to her cheeks. I don't know what you mean." Dr. Wallace patted her shoulder gently. "I've lived long enough to recognize certain looks between people. But don't worry, your secret is safe with me." In the weeks that followed, Hattie threw herself into her work with renewed dedication. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it the usual ailments: broken bones from spring planting accidents, childhood fevers, and the occasional gunshot wound from the saloon's weekend revelries. She delivered 3 babies, set countless fractures, and rode out to remote homesteads when patients couldn't come to town. Through it all, thoughts of Henry Fletcher lingered in the back of her mind. Each time the door to the doctor's office opened, her heart would leap with the possibility it might be him, only to settle back into disappointment when a different patient appeared. She found herself scanning the street on market days, hoping for a glimpse of his tall figure among the farmers and ranchers who came to town. But Henry did not return to Pine Creek. The gossip about her time at his cabin gradually subsided as newer scandals captured the town's attention. Dr. Wallace remained steadfastly supportive, defending her character whenever whispers reached his ears. Most of the townspeople treated her with the same respect as before, valuing her medical skills too highly to let rumors affect their trust in her care. One morning in late May, Hattie was organizing supplies in the surgery when Dr. Wallace entered with a troubled expression. "Ryder just came in from the Fletcher ranch," he said without preamble. "Henry's been injured, thrown from a horse while trying to rescue a calf from quicksand. The hand says it's bad, broken ribs at least, maybe internal bleeding. I'm too old for such a journey, Hattie. Can you go?" Hattie's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "Of course, I'll leave immediately." She packed her medical bag with trembling hands, adding extra bandages and herbal preparations for pain and inflammation. Dr. Wallace provided a vial of laudanum for severe pain and a letter authorizing her to act in his stead. "Take my horse," he insisted. "Jupiter is steadier on rough terrain than your mare." Within 20 minutes, Hattie was riding out of town beside the ranch hand who had brought the news. The young man, who introduced himself as Billy, explained that Henry had been injured the previous evening. "Boss wouldn't let me ride for help until morning," Billy said as they urged their horses to a brisk trot. "Said it wasn't bad enough to risk a night ride, but this morning he couldn't get up and his breathing didn't sound right. How far did he fall?" Hattie asked, her professional demeanor masking her inner turmoil. "About 10 feet off the bank into the creek. Horse landed partly on him before scrambling out. He managed to walk back to the cabin with help, but he was coughing blood by nightfall." The description sent fear coursing through Hattie. Broken ribs could puncture lungs or other organs, causing deadly internal bleeding. The 15-mile ride to Henry's ranch seemed interminable, though they made good time on the now dry trails. When they finally arrived, Hattie dismounted before Billy could help her down, grabbing her medical bag and rushing to the cabin door. The familiar interior was shadowed, the curtains drawn against the morning light. Henry lay on his bed, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his breathing shallow and labored. "Henry," Hattie whispered, moving quickly to his side and setting her bag on the floor. His eyes fluttered open at her voice, confusion giving way to recognition. "Hattie, am I dreaming?" "No, you stubborn man," she replied, her voice catching as she gently brushed damp hair from his forehead. "I'm here to treat you since you were too proud to send for help sooner." A weak smile touched his lips. "Didn't want to bother anyone." "Hush now," Hattie commanded, slipping into her professional role. I need to examine you. Billy, please heat water and find me clean cloths. As the ranch hand hurried to comply, Hattie carefully unbuttoned Henry's shirt, revealing a torso mottled with bruises. The worst discoloration spread across his left side, where the skin was stretched tight over visibly misaligned ribs. When she pressed gently near the area, Henry's breath hissed between clenched teeth. At least 3 broken ribs, she murmured, continuing her examination. And this bruising suggests internal bleeding. Henry watched her face, reading the concern she tried to hide. How bad? Hattie met his gaze steadily. Bad enough that you should have sent for me immediately. I need to bind your ribs and prepare a poultice for the bruising. The laudanum will help with pain. No laudanum, Henry said firmly, makes my head fuzzy. Don't argue with your nurse, Hattie retorted, measuring a dose into a spoon. Half now, half after I bind your ribs. To her surprise, Henry submitted without further protest, swallowing the bitter medicine with only a grimace. While waiting for it to take effect, Hattie prepared strips of clean linen from her supplies and mixed herbs for a poultice to reduce swelling. Billy returned with hot water and then tactfully made himself scarce, muttering about checking the livestock. Alone with Henry, Hattie worked efficiently, cleaning the abrasions on his side before applying the poultice and beginning the painful process of binding his ribs. You need to sit up for this part, she explained. I'll help you. Supporting his weight with her shoulder, Hattie eased Henry into a sitting position. He groaned, his face going ashen, but remained upright as she wrapped the bandages tightly around his torso. The intimacy of the situation, his bare skin under her hands, his breath warm against her neck, sent heat flooding through her that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. There, she said, securing the final bandage. That should stabilize the ribs while they heal. She helped him lie back, adjusting pillows to keep him partially upright, which would make breathing easier. His eyes were clearer now, watching her every movement as she tidied away her supplies. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. It's good to see you, even under these circumstances. Hattie paused, meeting his gaze. I've been hoping to see you two, though I would have preferred it not involve broken bones. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I considered riding into town several times. Why didn't you? The question escaped before she could stop it. Henry's expression grew serious. People talk, Hattie. After what happened, I didn't want to make things difficult for you. Things were already difficult, she admitted, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, but not because of you. They fell silent, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. Finally, Henry reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I missed you, he said simply. The words unleashed something in Hattie, a flood of emotions she had been holding back for weeks. I missed you too, more than I should have, perhaps. Henry's eyes darkened. There's no should about feelings, Hattie, they simply are. Before she could respond, a spasm of pain crossed his face and he pressed his free hand to his side, breathing shallowly until it passed. You need rest, Hattie said, professional concern overriding personal feelings. The second dose of laudanum will help you sleep. This time Henry didn't argue, accepting the medicine and allowing Hattie to adjust his blankets. As the laudanum began to take effect, his eyelids grew heavy. Will you stay? He murmured, fighting to keep his eyes open. Of course, Hattie promised, squeezing his hand. I'll be right here when you wake. For the next 3 days, Hattie barely left Henry's side. She changed his bandages, prepared simple broths and teas, and monitored his breathing for signs of the fluid buildup that could indicate a punctured lung. Billy handled the ranch chores, reporting in periodically and bringing supplies as needed. On the second day, Henry's fever spiked, his skin burning under Hattie's touch as infection set in. She fought it with cool compresses and herbal infusions, sitting beside him through the night as he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for his mother or murmuring about cattle that needed tending. Stay with me, Henry, she whispered, bathing his face with cool water. Please stay with me. By dawn, the fever broke, leaving Henry weak but lucid. He opened his eyes to find Hattie dozing in a chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arm at the edge of his mattress. The sight of her there, exhausted from caring for him, stirred something profound in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. Hattie, he said softly, reaching to touch her hair. She woke instantly, blinking sleep from her eyes. Henry, how are you feeling? Better, he replied honestly. Thanks to you. Relief flooded her face. Your fever broke. I was worried. That I might die, Henry finished for her. It would take more than a few broken ribs to keep me from. He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. From what? Hattie prompted, her heart beating faster. Henry's gaze held her steadily. From telling you what I should have said before you left my cabin that first time. I care for you, Hattie, more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time. Hattie's breath caught in her throat. I care for you too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I have nothing fancy to offer, Henry continued, his expression earnest. Just a small ranch, a simple life. It wouldn't be easy. I don't need easy, Hattie replied, finding courage in his honesty. I just need. She hesitated, then finished simply, you. The word hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Henry lifted his hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite his strength. When I'm healed, he said, I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing. Hattie turned her face into his palm, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm more than willing. By the fourth day, Henry was able to sit up for longer periods and even take short, careful walks around the cabin with Hattie's support. His recovery was progressing well, though complete healing would take weeks. Hattie knew she should return to town and her duties, but the thought of leaving him brought an ache to her chest. Dr. Wallace will be wondering where I am, she said as they shared a simple lunch of cornbread and beans. I should ride back tomorrow. Henry nodded, his expression somber. I understand, you have responsibilities. As do you, Hattie replied, glancing out the window at the ranch that needed his attention. But I'll come back if you want me to. I want that more than anything, Henry said, reaching across the table to take her hand. But I meant what I said about courting you properly. Once I can ride again, I'll come to town, take you to dinner at the hotel, bring you flowers, do things right. Hattie smiled, touched by his determination to honor traditional courtship despite the intimacy they had already shared through her nursing care. I'd like that. The next morning, Hattie prepared to leave, packing her medical supplies and instructing Billy on changing Henry's bandages. Her heart felt heavy as she saddled Dr. Wallace's horse, knowing it would be at least 2 weeks before Henry could safely make the journey to town. I've left written instructions for your care, she told Henry as they stood on the porch. Promise me you'll follow them. No riding, no heavy lifting, and change the bandages daily. Yes, madam, Henry replied with mock solemnity, though his eyes were serious. I'll be a model patient, Hattie laughed, the sound catching on the emotion in her throat. Somehow I doubt that. Henry reached for her hand, drawing her closer. Thank you for saving my life. You saved mine first, she reminded him softly. We're even now. Not quite, Henry murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. There's still one thing. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Hattie had no desire to retreat. Instead, she rose on tiptoe to meet him, her hands resting lightly on his chest as their lips met in a gentle, questioning kiss. Time seemed to stop as the tentative touch deepened into something more certain. Henry's arms encircled her carefully, mindful of his healing ribs, while Hattie's hands slid up to his shoulders. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster, their faces flushed with more than the morning sun. Now we're even, Henry said hoarsely, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. For now, Hattie agreed with a smile that held promise for the future. The ride back to Pine Creek gave Hattie ample time to reflect on all that had happened. She had arrived in Wyoming seeking escape from grief, and found not just purpose in her work, but something she hadn't dared hope for, the beginning of love with a man whose quiet strength and kindness had captured her heart when she least expected it. Dr. Wallace greeted her return with evident relief, though his eyes twinkled knowingly when she explained the details of Henry's condition and her extended stay to provide care. "And how is the patient's prognosis?" he asked as they shared tea in his office. "Favorable if he follows instructions," Hattie replied, trying to maintain a professional tone. "The ribs will heal completely with proper rest." "And his other condition?" the doctor inquired innocently. "The one affecting his heart." Hattie nearly choked on her tea. "I'm not sure what you mean," Dr. Wallace chuckled. My dear girl, I'm old, not blind. The way that man looked at you at dinner that night, well, let's just say I've seen that look before, on my own face when I courted my late wife. Hattie felt heat rise to her cheeks. He has expressed an intention to call on me when he's well enough to travel. Good, the doctor said firmly. You deserve happiness, Hattie, and from what I've observed, Mr. Fletcher is a man of integrity who would treat you with the respect you deserve. Thank you, Hattie said, touched by his approval. Your good opinion means a great deal to me. Life in Pine Creek resumed its normal rhythm, though for Hattie, everything felt subtly different. Colors seemed brighter, her work more satisfying, her interactions with patients more meaningful. Even Mrs. Wilkins' barely veiled inquiries about that rancher who rescued you couldn't dampen her spirits. 2 weeks after her return, Hattie was inventorying medical supplies when she heard the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves stopping outside the office. Her heart leapt, but she forced herself to continue counting bandages, not wanting to appear too eager should it be just another patient. The bell above the door jingled, and Hattie turned to see Henry standing in the doorway, hat in hand. He looked thinner than when she'd left him, but color had returned to his face, and he stood straight despite what must still be tender ribs. Mr. Fletcher, she greeted him formally, aware that the door to the waiting room stood open where anyone passing might see them. How are your ribs healing? Much better, Miss Garner, he replied, matching her professional tone though his eyes conveyed a different message entirely. I wondered if Dr. Wallace might examine me to ensure all is well. The doctor is on his lunch break, Hattie informed him, setting aside her inventory sheet, but I'd be happy to check your progress. Henry nodded, closing the door behind him. I was hoping you'd say that. Once in the examination room, with the door firmly shut against curious eyes, Henry's formal demeanor melted away. He crossed to Hattie in 2 quick strides and gathered her into a gentle embrace. I've missed you, he murmured against her hair. Hattie returned his embrace carefully, mindful of his healing ribs. And I you, but you shouldn't have ridden so soon, you could have re-injured yourself. Henry chuckled, pulling back to look at her. See, I knew you'd scold me, but I couldn't wait any longer. His expression grew more serious. I spent those 2 weeks thinking about what I want, Hattie, about the life I want to build, and I know with absolute certainty that I want you to be part of it. Hattie's heart seemed to expand in her chest. I want that too. Good, Henry said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Because I've spoken with Dr. Wallace already. He's given his blessing for me to court you, and I've brought something for you. From his pocket, he withdrew a small posy of wildflowers tied with a ribbon. It's not much compared to the fancy bouquets you probably had in Boston, but it's perfect, Hattie interrupted, accepting the flowers with a radiant smile. Absolutely perfect. Henry's courtship of Hattie over the following months became the talk of Pine Creek, though for once the gossip was more admiring than critical. He rode into town every Saturday, weather permitting, taking Hattie for walks along the creek, to dinner at the hotel, or to church socials where they danced together under the approving eye of Dr. Wallace. On weekdays, Henry focused on rebuilding his strength and expanding his ranch, adding 20 acres and 15 head of cattle to his holdings. Hattie continued her nursing duties, but she found herself increasingly drawn to the idea of a life beyond Pine Creek, a life with Henry on his land, where they could build something meaningful together. As summer gave way to autumn, their feelings deepened from initial attraction to something more profound. They shared stories of their pasts, dreams for their futures, fears and hopes alike. Hattie told Henry about her sheltered childhood in Boston and her struggle to establish herself as a nurse in a male-dominated profession. Henry spoke of his time in the war, the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him, and his determination to create something lasting from the wilderness. One crisp October day, Henry invited Hattie to ride out to his ranch, their first visit there since his injury. Billy met them at the cabin with a knowing grin before tactfully disappearing toward the corral, leaving them alone. I've made some changes since you were last here, Henry said, leading Hattie inside. The cabin had indeed been transformed. New curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt adorned the bed, and a second rocking chair sat beside the original near the fireplace. On the table stood a vase of late-blooming wildflowers. But the most significant change was an addition built onto the back of the cabin, a second room with its own small window, and a door that provided privacy from the main living area. "What do you think?" Henry asked as he showed her the addition. "It could be a sick room for when neighbors need medical care, or, Hattie prompted when he hesitated. Henry turned to face her, taking both her hands in his, or a nursery, someday if you wanted." The implication of his words sent warmth spreading through Hattie's chest. "Henry Fletcher, are you asking me something?" "Not yet," he replied with a smile that made her heart skip. "But soon. I wanted you to see this first, to see that I'm preparing a place for our future, if you'll have me." Hattie stepped closer, raising one hand to touch his face. "I can think of nothing I want more than a future with you." Henry's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "Even though it means living miles from town, facing hard winters and uncertain harvests. Having a cowboy for a husband instead of a Boston gentleman, especially because of all those things," Hattie assured him, rising on tiptoe to press a soft kiss to his lips. "I never belonged in Boston the way I belong here, with you." Their kiss deepened, conveying the love and longing that had grown between them over the months. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their eyes bright with emotion. "I should take you back to town," Henry said reluctantly, his voice rough, "before I forget myself completely." Hattie nodded, though every part of her wished to stay. "Soon we won't have to say goodbye at the end of the day." "Very soon," Henry promised, pressing a final kiss to her forehead. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning after church services, Henry asked Hattie to walk with him to the small garden behind the church. The late October sun cast golden light over the dying flowers and autumn leaves, creating a setting more beautiful to Hattie than any formal garden in Boston. Henry seemed uncharacteristically nervous, his hands fidgeting with his hat as they strolled between the garden rows. "Is everything all right?" Hattie asked, concerned by his unusual demeanor. "Better than all right," Henry replied, stopping beside a bench beneath an old apple tree. "Hattie, I had a whole speech prepared, but standing here with you now, the words seem inadequate." Understanding dawned, and Hattie's heart began to race. "Sometimes the simplest words are best," she encouraged softly. Henry nodded, taking a deep breath before dropping to one knee before her. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "Hattie Garner, from the moment you appeared at my door that stormy night, my life changed in ways I never expected. You brought warmth and purpose back into my existence when I didn't even realize what was missing." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I love you, your courage, your compassion, your strength. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." He opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that caught the autumn sunlight. "This was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would wear it as my wife." Tears blurred Hattie's vision as joy overwhelmed her. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Henry, I would be proud to be your wife." Henry's face transformed with a smile of such pure happiness that it took Hattie's breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, then rose to gather her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that drew chuckles from churchgoers who witnessed the scene from a distance. "I love you," Hattie said as he set her down, the words feeling both monumental and entirely natural. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, especially not in the wilds of Wyoming," Henry laughed, pressing his forehead to hers. "And I never imagined that a Boston nurse with a stubborn streak would be the answer to prayers I hadn't even voiced." Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in Pine Creek's small church, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the approaching Christmas season. The entire town turned out for the occasion, even Mrs. Wilkins, who had eventually conceded that the romance between the nurse and the rancher was indeed proper and even enviable. Dr. Wallace gave Hattie away, his elderly face beaming with paternal pride as he placed her hand in Henry's at the altar. Hattie wore a simple gown of ivory silk that she had ordered from Denver, while Henry cut an impressive figure in a new black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. The reception was held at the hotel, where townsfolk and neighboring ranchers alike celebrated with food, music, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. As the festivities wound down, Henry and Hattie slipped away to begin their journey home to the cabin that would now be their shared dwelling. Night had fallen by the time they arrived, stars glittering in the clear December sky. Henry lifted Hattie from her horse, but instead of setting her down, he carried her to the porch. "Welcome home, Mrs. Fletcher," he said softly, pushing open the door. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and warmth from the hearth. Billy had clearly been busy during their absence. The fire burned merrily, fresh flowers stood on the table despite the winter season, and the bed was turned down invitingly. "It's perfect," Hattie whispered as Henry set her gently on her feet. "Everything is perfect." Henry closed the door against the cold night air, then turned to his bride, his expression a mixture of tenderness and desire that made Hattie's heart race. "Do you remember what I said to you that first night?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. Hattie nodded, her eyes shining with love and memory. "You said I would never freeze again, and I meant it," Henry murmured, lowering his lips to hers. "As long as I live, you'll always have a home here and warmth and love." Their kiss deepened, the culmination of months of longing and the beginning of a lifetime together. Outside, snow began to fall softly, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. But within the cabin's walls, only warmth existed, the warmth of the fire, of shared dreams, and of two hearts that had found in each other exactly what they needed. 5 years later, Hattie stood on the porch of what was now a much larger cabin, watching as Henry taught their 4-year-old son, James, how to groom a gentle pony. Her hand rested protectively over the swell of her belly where their second child grew, a daughter, she suspected, though she hadn't shared this intuition with Henry yet. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Henry's cattle herd had tripled in size, and the addition of sheep, Hattie's suggestion, had diversified their income. A small garden provided vegetables in summer, and Hattie's medical skills were sought by neighbors from miles around. She had even established a monthly clinic in the new schoolhouse that had been built halfway between their ranch and Pine Creek. Life wasn't always easy. Winters brought blizzards that sometimes trapped them indoors for days. Summer droughts threatened the pastures. Occasional disputes with other ranchers over water rights required diplomacy and compromise. But through it all, the foundation of love and respect they had built remained unshaken. "Mama, look," James called excitedly, perched on his father's shoulders. "Papa says I can ride Thunder all by myself next spring. Does he now?" Hattie replied with a laugh, descending the porch steps to join them. "We'll see about that, young man." Henry set their son down and drew Hattie close, his hand covering hers over their unborn child. "He'll be ready," he assured her. "He's got your determination and courage. And your stubborn streak," Hattie teased, leaning into his embrace. Henry chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her cheek. "Perhaps, but that's served us well enough, hasn't it?" Hattie looked up at him, this man who had opened his door to a freezing stranger, and in doing so had changed both their lives forever. His face was more weathered now, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun and the beginnings of silver threading through his dark hair. But his eyes were the same clear and blue as the Wyoming sky, and filled with the same love she had come to depend on like the sunrise. "It has indeed," she agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "Very well indeed." As James ran to check on his favorite chicken in the nearby coop, Henry kept his arm around Hattie, both of them watching their son with pride and wonder. "Did you ever imagine this?" Henry asked quietly. "That night during the storm when you were locked out in the cold?" Hattie shook her head, leaning against his solid strength. "Never. I was just hoping to survive the night. And instead you found a lifetime," Henry said, his voice rich with emotion. "We both did," Hattie corrected him, taking his hand and placing it more firmly against the spot where their second child had just kicked. "And it's only just beginning." The Wyoming wind whipped across the prairie, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of another storm. But within the circle of Henry's arms, with their son's laughter ringing in the air and their second child stirring beneath her heart, Hattie knew with absolute certainty that she would never again know the cold of that desperate night, not in body, not in spirit, not in heart. She had found her home, her purpose, her love, and in doing so, she had fulfilled the promise Henry made when he first opened his door to a freezing stranger. She would never freeze again.